Hello, this is Dr. Alan Branch. I am Professor of Christian Ethics at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is my third and a brief set of videos about the morality of contraception from a Christian perspective. So let me remind everyone listening of something I said at the beginning of my first video, that I am not an OBGYN, I'm not a physician. I am a person who teaches ethics, attempting to help Christians think about these things. So before you make decisions about any of these issues for yourself as a husband and wife, be sure to have a serious discussion with each other and with your own physician. Don't make decisions based solely on what I say, but I do hope that I give you some good food for thought for moral reflection. So in this third video, we're going to talk about what Christians think and how we should think about contraception and what biblical issues come to foreplay. Most famously is the Roman Catholic position. Of course, Roman Catholicism says that any form of artificial birth control is not permitted, but that natural family planning methods are permitted. This is based on a particular view of natural law and some other things. So I'm going to skip over the history. I'm just going to go right on up to Humanae Vitae in 1968. And this papal encyclical was written in direct response to the oral contraceptive pill. It's a fascinating journey of the way the encyclical was finally written, but nonetheless, when it was published in 1968, it was in direct response to the OCP, and basically it says, no way, Jose, do not use the OCP if you're a faithful Roman Catholic. And it says in there that every marital act, and I quote in English, says, must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. And one of the things that comes out in Humanae Vitae and later on in Evangelium Vitae is this idea of unitive and procreative aspects of sex and marriage. And so that these two big categories, unitive, that part of sex that helps a husband and wife love each other and express their love, procreative, having babies, that these two, they are two definite purposes of sex, but they should always be joined and they should never be separated. So I suppose that really is the debate, as stated for us, repeated in Evangelium Vitae, which reaffirms opposition to artificial contraception and also connects abortion to contraception. I will say that it is fascinating. We saw a rise of contraception in the 60s. 1960, the OCP is developed and produced and marketed. And then we see the rise of abortion in the 70s with Roe v. Wade. So it is fascinating when Margaret Sanger, one of my least favorite people ever, and I do not agree with the worldview or the ethics advocated by Margaret Sanger at any level, but one of the arguments she was making in the 1920s was, well, if we have more contraception, there'll be fewer abortions. Well, that's not what's happened. We've got more contraception and we have more abortions. So certainly Pope John Paul II was certainly correct to connect the two issues. So I'm going to skip over the summary of the Roman Catholic opposition to the OCP, and let me just go ahead and give you some arguments pro and con. So why would some people, both religious and non-religious, oppose contraception? First, it has disassociated sex from raising children, and indeed it's now considered an option. It used to not be considered an option. When you got married, it was just assumed you're going to have children, but now children are considered an option to marriage. And also outside of marriage, many Christians have in fact argued that disassociating sex from having children has helped create an environment where we see the increase in the number of unwed pregnancies and single moms. To this degree, men are now conditioned to see women as merely something providing sexual pleasure to men, and the idea of procreation has been pushed to the side. Therefore, if the lady does get pregnant, then the guy just says, hey, I don't want anything to do with that. I was in this all about the sex. I didn't want the child. So some have argued that this mindset has contributed to the massive increase in out-of-wedlock pregnancies and single moms. It's again, to go back to the Roman Catholic position, they're going to argue contraception is contrary to natural law. Basically, natural law says things have a purpose. Well, what is the purpose for the procreative system for male and females? It's to have babies, and we shouldn't interfere with that. It's an oversimplification. It's the practice of contraception has been advocated by some nasty people with eugenic ideas, and that is true. Margaret Sanger was, from my perspective, a morally deeply disconcerting and deeply concerning. It bothers me at multiple levels, and I disagree with her so strongly as a Christian who believes in the value of all people and the sanctity of sex and the sanctity of human life. So we just have to own up to it. If you are a Christian and you're going to argue for the use of contraception, you have to understand that it has been advocated by some nasty people. Some will say, well, listen, there's only one example in the Bible of contraception taking place, and that's Onan in Genesis 38, and God killed him, so therefore you should be opposed to contraception. We'll talk about that in a moment. Some will argue that it contributes to the widespread sexual immorality. There's this whole question about the degree to which the oral contraceptive pill is related to the sexual revolution. I'll just give you my summary. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I believe we would have had a sexual revolution in the late 60s and early 70s without the OCP. Mechanical contraception condoms were so widespread, and there was a change in sexual morals, rejection of our Judeo-Christian heritage about sexual restraint. I think you would have had a sexual revolution. The OCP certainly was an accelerant to the sexual revolution. To give you an idea of how the contraceptions are connected to sexual immorality, this is an advertisement by a couple of liberal Colorado not-for-profits back after the Affordable Care Act was passed. And they advertise this as Susie and Nate hot to trot, and here's this lovely young lady, and she's so excited because she got her thumb up there. She's saying, yeah, I've got the oral contraceptive pill. And look at this horrid advertisement. This is just reprehensible. OMG, he's hot. Let's hope he's as easy to get as this birth control. My health insurance covers the pill, which means all I have to worry about is getting him between the covers. It is interesting. Usually in our culture, we think about males objectifying women as objects of sexual predation. But here you have a young lady objectifying a male as an object of sexual gratification. He's only good to her as he's able to please her sexually. And it's all tied to the contraceptives. And they give this disclaimer down at the bottom. The pill doesn't protect you from STDs. Condoms and common sense do that. No, condoms do not. What does is following God's plan, which is purity before marriage and faithfulness in marriage. But if you understand the ridiculous moral reasoning in this advertisement from these two liberal not-for-profits, then you understand why some people believe that contraception promotes sexual immorality. Certainly it does for some people. Another is that somehow, again, we've talked about this, they're going to claim some forms of contraception have an abortifacient effect, and you have to take each form differently. The progestin implant, the OCP, the IUD, the copper versus hormonal IUD, then the emergency contraceptive, and then Plan B versus Ella. They all have different functions, and so I focused on one in the previous video, which is the most common, the oral contraceptive. So they're going to claim it devalues human life, that it has a negative effect on women's health. We talked about some of that. And a lot of this is associated with other factors that work in the woman's life, lifestyles and behaviors. Some will say that it has cheapened the connection between love and sex. What about favors and arguments in favor of contraception? Not all of these are religious. Again, some of these are secular. So one of the most common arguments in favor of contraception is the exploding world population. Therefore, contraception is a good thing. 7 billion people, how many can we feed in the world? We need to control the world's population. It allows for couples to plan for children. It can keep women and couples from poverty. They're going to argue that contraception keeps women out of poverty by keeping them from having children. And they're going to say it allows for spontaneity. Here are some religious arguments in favor of contraception. Most people making these religious arguments reject this one. They just think that human flourishing is a good thing. But I'm just saying that it is a non-religious argument in favor. But most non-religious people are going to argue along these lines. They're going to say the natural law arguments against conception are not convincing. They're just not swayed by the moral argumentation, the Catholic argument. But primarily it's going to come down to this. and again, we're talking about Christians referring to the act of sex within marriage. And I'm assuming we all, if you're a right-thinking Christian who holds the Bible in high regard, you're going to believe that sex is designed by God for marriage, heterosexual, monogamous between one man and one woman. The argument's going to be there are multiple purposes for sex. I suggest at least 7. Procreation is definitely one of the purposes for sex. Tied to that, interestingly, is it's through procreation that we are able to exercise dominion over the earth. This is all about human flourishing and the goodness of that. But also it facilitates shameless intimacy between a husband and wife, that naked and not ashamed, Genesis 2:25. And then comfort, that when we are sad and discouraged, that we find comfort in the arms of our spouse. Song of Songs talks about relaxation and play, this just joy of sexual pleasure between a husband and wife. It's also a way to celebrate our love for each other. It's a way to express, I love you and I want to show you that I love you. And then Paul also says it's a form of protection against sexual immorality. Basically, he suggests, or he doesn't suggest, he says in 1 Corinthians 7 that a healthy sex life at home is a protection against doing all sorts of things that God says don't do. So there are 7 purposes. Now the question is, some of my fellow believers will argue, well, yes, I don't know that I disagree with all those, but can you actually separate them? This is the procreative aspect. They're going to say all of these are the unitive aspects. Well, can you ever separate them? And they're going to say, well, no, they always have to be joined. And I'll just go ahead and tell you where I'm heading. I don't think they always have to be joined, and I'll try to talk about that in just a second. So let's talk about some passages of relevance or claimed relevance. Let me just say, first of all, that procreation should be really an expected part of marriage. Genesis 1:26 through 28, verse 26, everyone's made in the image of God. Verse 27, male and female, our gender is a part of the goodness of God's creation. And then in verse 28, he talks about one of the reasons he's given the different genders. It's procreation, that we would have children as part of his dominion mandate to exercise godly stewardship of the world that God has given us. So, again, an expected part of marriage should be, from my perspective, at least the hope that we can have children. Now, this does not, from my perspective, mean that it is wrong for a married couple to have sex even if they are unable to have children. Certainly not. Even the Roman Catholic positions tend to agree with that statement there. What I would argue, though, is this passage is informative enough that, barring issues related to infertility, which are so grievous, and sincere couples that love the Lord for reasons they don't know haven't been able to have children, from my perspective, I believe it just should be expected at some point we are going to have children. I don't think that means we should have, as we're required to have, as many as we possibly can, though there's nothing wrong with large families. But it does mean that if a couple is intentionally deciding, for whatever reason, we are never, ever, ever going to have, we don't want any children, this passage, along with Psalm 127, raises some concerns about such a mindset. Genesis 38, opponents of contraception point to this text. If you don't know the story, it's about liberate marriage. Onan's brother dies. It's part of the culture in that day. It's one of those practices I'm glad we're not doing today. He took his deceased brother's wife as his own, but every time they would have sexual intercourse, he would spill his seed on the ground. He would practice coitus interruptus. Well, what happens is God judges him for this. The question is, was he judged for the act of contraception, or was he judged for abusing liberate marriage? It seems to me that the real issue was his abuse of liberate marriage, not for the mere act of coitus interruptus. So I'm not convinced that Genesis 38 means that contraception is prohibited. Psalm 127, a beautiful passage. Children are a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb. Happy is the man who hath his quiver full of them. Some Christians have taken this passage to argue for what they call a quiver full, teaching that means you should have as many children as you possibly can. I don't think that's what the text is teaching. I don't think the text in Psalm 127 is mandating having as many children as you possibly can. What it does teach is that babies are a good thing, and that I just say, again, the idea that you have to have as many children as you possibly can and anti-contraception, Psalm 127 somehow proves contraception is wrong. That's proof texting. But what the text does teach is this, that children should be received as a gift and a blessing. And so the mindset that we are afraid of children, marriage is just about, and we don't want any children whatsoever, it's really incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile such a mindset with Psalm 127. The Song of Songs, let me just say this, you see a celebration of the unitive aspects of sexual intercourse without any mention of procreation. So it's all about the unitive aspects, and there's no discussion of procreation, which is one of the reasons I reject the Roman Catholic position. 1 Corinthians 7:5, do not deprive each other except for a time. Devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again. Otherwise, Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So Paul indicates that a normal component of marriage is sexual intercourse between the husband and wife. It should just be expected. And he's not talking about procreation here. He's talking about other issues, the unitive aspects of sex and marriage. So, should Christian couples utilize contraceptives? Perhaps I should have stated this earlier. Maybe I should move this to the start of my essay or lecture, but let me just say this. First, two premises I'm working on. Sex is designed by God to be experienced in heterosexual monogamous marriage, and that's God's safety. That's God's game plan, and that's the consistent message of Scripture. And then secondly, human life begins at conception. So everything I say has these two moral principles in mind. That said, the use of contraception to facilitate sexual immorality is certainly sinful. So if you're a young Christian and you're looking at this going, oh, well, I don't think I want to try some form of contraception so that I can have sex outside of marriage, then the answer is no, we should not do that. So this ties to my first point, concerns about sexual immorality. The widespread availability of contraception does make this a greater temptation for young Christians. And so I want to encourage you to think carefully about how the availability of these things in our culture makes it more tempting for young Christians to think, well, it's okay to go do these things. And so we have to acknowledge, just like that Loretta Lynn song that I mentioned in the first little video, it has facilitated to a degree this greater acceptance of promiscuity. But we as Christians don't do what the world does. We're supposed to be different. And then secondly, marriage is the appropriate arena for sex. Let's just say, and drive home again, Genesis 2:24 through 25 is foundational for marriage, and it is there within the marriage covenant that we experience shameless intimacy, not outside of it in a promiscuous lifestyle. So must the unitive and creative aspects of sex always be joined? I'm not convinced. So I would point you back to the Song of Songs and the 1 Corinthians 7:5, both of which have extended discussions of the unitive aspects of sex and marriage without any discussion of procreation. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind. You can see where I'm going. If it's possible to separate the unitive and creative aspects of sex, then it doesn't seem wrong to me for a couple to practice contraception so that they might celebrate the unitive aspects. However, keep in mind what I say next. Intentional childlessness is problematic. I have debated whether or not to use the word sin here. I'm more comfortable with the word problematic. It raises concerns, and here's why. Genesis 1:26 through 28 does indicate that, hey, if we get married at some point, we should hope for children to come along. Doesn't mean that from my perspective, we have to have as many children as possible, again, but it does mean that, from my perspective, again, if a Christian couple says, we want to do everything we possibly can never to have children, and it's not our goal ever to procreate, then I would challenge you to think more deeply about these passages. There are extenuating circumstances related to health and infertility. That's a completely different issue, and we have mercy for Christian couples that experience the grief, the unrequited grief of infertility. So I'm setting that off in a different moral category. There are couples who carry the secret pain of being unable to have children, yet other Christians all too often, without knowing the facts, automatically assume they have chosen to be childless for worldly reasons. So I want to encourage you, just because you see a couple at church who's been married for 10 years and they don't have kids, don't automatically assume, oh, well, they're not doing what God says. Well, we don't know, and I don't know that we are required to know. There are certain things that are between a Christian couple, or perhaps a Christian couple and their pastor, that need to remain private. We don't know, and we need to be very careful about being judgmental in these things. Some attitudes about contraception make children a bothersome intrusion. I've already talked about that. Children are a blessing from the Lord, Psalm 127, but we live in a culture that sees children as an intrusion. Listen, every one of us watching this video, we're an intrusion into someone's life, but they chose life, they chose to have children, and we should all be glad they did. We're here today. What about financial concerns? One of the most common reasons I hear for using contraception is finances. And the issue that pops up here in the United States, if you're watching this from outside the States, perhaps not so much, but here in the United States, it is college education. So I would just say a few things. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So I think we do have a responsibility to be financially informed about the decisions we make, carefully understanding. Here's what I would warn, though. A lot of men, when men bring up to me financial concerns about children, regrettably, I have encountered situations where the male's financial concern was not house, food, clothing, basic needs, but when they said financial concern, what they meant was, if I have children, I'm not going to be able to buy some fabulous car or some boat or some motorcycle or some other thing that I want. So just make sure that we understand what we say by financial concerns. And again, college education seems to be the one that pops up most frequently here in the United States. Is the OCP moral? I'm prepared to argue that when used appropriately, the combined oral contraceptive is. My friend, we don't know each other, but she's my friend in Christ. I've read her work. Megan Breast, Australian physician, says the progestin implant is moral. I'm not sure she's quite convinced me, but she is pro-life. Read her work for that perspective. So sometimes I hear people say, well, we need to have large families so we can have more Christians. Well, certainly a large family can produce people who believe in faith in Jesus Christ. Certainly that's possible. We just want to remember, every child comes to faith in Jesus Christ on their own, and there's no guarantee that a child born into a Christian family will become a Christian. Let me say it without equivocation, the best evangelistic field in the world is a mother and father who love Jesus Christ deeply, model that faith before their children. It's the most natural thing in the world for a child who sees this modeled and lived out on a day-to-day basis. But just keep in mind that just because a child's born into a Christian family doesn't guarantee they're going to become a Christian. And finally, I want to urge us to be kind to each other. I've argued that contraception can be used in appropriate ways by a Christian couple as long as we're defining finances in the right way, we're defining some of these concerns narrowly, but be kind to each other. Let's remember we're on the same team. Small families can be good. Large families can be good. Let's try to refrain from calling each other names. Let's try to refrain from being so hostile, and let's tone down some of our discussion, and let's celebrate each other and love each other as Christians in Christ. And remember, you do not know another person's motives. So let's be very clear about going to motive, about why people have large families or about why they have small families. We don't know, and so to a degree, we have to set some of these things aside and allow for Christian liberty in Christ. I hope this has been helpful to you. Perhaps it's given you a starting point for reflection. You may have ideas of your own and thoughts of your own. Talk with your pastor, talk with your OBGYN and your physician, and make a decision that honors God and honors the sanctity of human life.